This is Adam with Gwinnett County Public Libraries, and welcome to this episode of Tales from Another Page, a series where we use discussions about world literature to explore the traditions and histories of other cultures. In honor of Women's History Month, this episode is focused on Genji Monogatari, sometimes translated as The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu. The Tale of Genji is considered by most to be the masterpiece of Japanese literature and the world's first novel. In this episode, we'll also discuss how women came to dominate the Japanese literary world. Murasaki Shikibu, known to many as Lady Murasaki, was born sometime around the year 970. Although she was technically nobility, her family was obscure enough that the date of her birth, her fate, and even her real name aren't exactly known. It was common at the time for women to take the government posts of their male relatives as a kind of surname, and the Shikibu part of her name refers to the Shikibu Sho, the name of the ministry where her father worked. Murasaki, meanwhile, is actually the name of the female lead in The Tale of Genji, which she herself uses as a kind of nickname. We do have some guesses as to who she may have actually been, but for now, we can just refer to her as Lady Murasaki. Having been born in the 10th century, Lady Murasaki lived through the peak of Japan's Heian period, a time of high imperial power, peace, and creativity. In the Heian period, both men and women were expected to master various arts such as calligraphy, poetry, painting, music, and even go-playing. Although Heian women had many constraints placed upon their freedom and lifestyles, this time period was unusual in that women had almost complete creative freedom, even respect. One important limitation that we should discuss, though, is that it was considered unbecoming, although not outright taboo, for women to learn Chinese. See, it wasn't until the 5th or 6th century CE that the Japanese began to widely adopt their own written language. By Lady Murasaki's time, Japan had only been writing for a few hundred years and hadn't yet built a deep literary foundation of their own. For this reason, the Japanese still relied heavily on China and the Chinese language for its long and old catalog of poetry and stories. Fluency in the Chinese language meant access to literature and history, and these were considered to be masculine affairs. Some women, like Lady Murasaki, learned it anyway in private and studied Chinese literature either on their own or in groups behind closed doors, but this wasn't typical. Men, meanwhile, not only read Chinese, but they also used it to write all their poetry, prose, verses, and letters. The result of all this was that the only people artistically engaging with the Japanese language were women. In fact, hiragana, the foundation of the Japanese written language, was so associated with women's writing that it was often called onade, or women's hand, in this period. While men were busy reading and writing in Chinese and engaging with the Chinese literary world, women were busy single-handedly forging Japan's literary identity. The most significant literary form that these women came up with are monogatari, long, novel-like stories that were written in prose, but which incorporated poetry, verse, court records, and even historical documents to create a style that is uniquely Japanese. Monogatari have a variety of styles and genres, ranging from tales of courtly love, like the Tale of Genji, to science fiction adventures. In fact, the oldest surviving monogatari, Kaguya Hime no Monogatari, depicts a princess from the moon who descends down to Japan in order to escape a celestial war. These monogatari became so popular that men even started writing their own, but when they did, typically did so under a woman's name. Around the year 1000, Lady Murasaki used her education in Chinese literature to write her own monogatari, The Tale of Genji. Marrying the unique Japanese format to the lessons she learned from centuries of Chinese stories, Lady Murasaki created a work so masterful, so popular, that it became the foundation of Japanese literature for the next 1,000 years, and its influence can even be felt in the literature, film, anime, and other Japanese media of today. So what is The Tale of Genji actually about? This long story focuses on the life of Prince Genji, the son of the Japanese emperor and a low-born lady of divine beauty. With his mother's radiant beauty and his father's royal blood, Genji is so talented and so good-looking that, as a child, everyone at the court calls him the Radiant Prince. Unfortunately, Genji squanders much of this potential, and he grows up to become a frivolous, fickle, and flirtatious man, to the point that his life story, this monogatari, is told almost exclusively through tales of his numerous affairs. As a child, Genji falls in love with Fujitsubo, his father's favorite consort, who is strictly off-limits. With this love still burning in his heart, Genji is forced into an arranged marriage with another woman, and, at least at first, they both hate one another. As a teenager, Genji neglects his wife and sneaks out every opportunity he can get to go and engage in affairs with random women, hoping to find someone who can fill the Fujitsubo-shaped hole in his heart. At first, many of these affairs have comical endings. Genji often finds that he snuck into the wrong woman's room, or he might discover that the woman he had been flirting with from behind a screen or through letters was actually old enough to be his grandmother. On one occasion, he pursued a woman so strongly that his actions can only be described as stalking. And yet, when he finally meets her, he realizes that her nose is slightly red and he completely loses interest on the spot. As Genji grows older, though, his engagement in these affairs begins to have dramatic, dire consequences. In one episode, Genji abandons a woman, as he often does, and her overpowering despair and jealousy manifests into a wandering spirit which begins killing those that Genji loves. I won't spoil what happens from here, but this story, which is at times hilarious, takes dark turns as Genji gets older and his actions begin to actually catch up with him. One of the things that I really enjoyed about reading this book is that it doesn't idealize Genji, the Japanese nobles, or the court. Lady Murasaki depicts the Japanese court as a superficial place where everyone's gossiping, everyone's engaging in illicit affairs, and everyone is at all times ready to stab their neighbor in the back. Even Genji, the Emperor's son and the so-called Radiant Prince, is a really awful person, with his manipulative treatment of women bordering on emotional abuse. And since Genji is constantly sneaking around to meet women, through his eyes we get a behind-the-scenes look at what life in the Japanese court was actually like outside of all the ceremony and circumstance. Although there are a few evil spirits and prophecies sprinkled throughout, Genji's story is otherwise excruciatingly realistic. Considering this, it's shocking to me how much of a sensation the Tale of Genji was with the Japanese nobility. The contents of the book should have been scandalous, but it was so universally loved that Lady Murasaki was even invited to become a personal assistant to the Empress herself. Since we know so little about Lady Murasaki, it's hard to say when she started writing, how long it took her, or if she had intended to write more but died before she could. The book that exists today actually has a somewhat abrupt ending, and it's disputed as to whether or not this was done intentionally. Either way, the 54 chapters she did compose are masterfully written. Even to me, someone reading it 1,000 years later and on the other side of the world, it doesn't feel like it aged a day. Some of the situations that she puts Genji into had me laughing out loud, while others, like the very first chapter, brought me to tears. It was an awesome experience and I can't recommend it enough. If you're at all interested in Japanese culture or history, come grab one of our copies of The Tale of Genji at your local Gwinnett County Public Library. Unfortunately, with the rise of the samurai and the end of Japan's peaceful Heian period in the 12th century, Japanese women found themselves largely disenfranchised and stripped of much of the intellectual and artistic equality that women like Lady Murasaki once enjoyed. The Monogatari came to eventually depict wars, tales of revenge, and clan rivalries, and became dominated by men. Despite this unfortunate shift, the tales of love and adventure that the Heian women originally wrote still stand tall and continue to dominate Japanese culture to this day. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a lovely day.